Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Curious Convos. Tonight we're having John Campbell and Ben Calleja both talking about a coaching way of leading. John Campbell is the founding director of Growth Coaching International, an organisation that provides coaching and coaching services to schools and school leaders, teachers all across Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the Middle East, Spain, and Central and South America. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Good to be with everyone.
We also have Ben Calleja, who is a director across several regions in Australia at Growth Coaching International. In addition to his work as an executive coach and facilitator, he also is responsible for the leadership and strategic direction of the business across those regions. Good evening, Ben.
Hi, Andrea. Nice to be with you.
Would you two like to start your conversation that we're really looking forward to tonight?
Yeah,
Great.
John, good to see you too.
Yeah. Hi, Ben. Good to be chatting about this.
Excellent. And you're over in Sydney, and a bit later on than I am here in Perth.
Yes, I am. It's 7:30 here. We've had a pretty wintry day, but it's getting to winter, so that's fair enough, I guess.
Yeah, that's it. Well, look, the focus, I guess, for our conversation that we had in mind there was really that coaching way of leading. So the idea of, we talk a lot about coaching and then also the lens of leadership and where does leadership fit into that. And I know you've been thinking about this for a little while and you've had some, obviously been prompted with some different reading that you've done. So just even in that term, a coaching way of leading, I'd be curious to know what got you interested in that to begin with.
Yeah, it is an interesting phrase, and greetings to everyone wherever you are too. Thanks for joining in, and we look forward to maybe some questions and comments that you might want to add as we go through, because this is something we're just exploring and thinking about, and we haven't kind of thought it all through. So there's opportunity for lots of questions, and we hope you'll make use of that. But the coaching way of being. I guess it came out of some things I was reading about in terms of complex adaptive systems and describing organizations in this kind of way and using different language, different metaphors to talk about how organizations were really quite fluid and were basically made up of networks of people talking to each other to get things done. Whereas in the past, there's been older, more, if you like, machine-oriented type models. So as I started to think about all these kind of ways that people were talking, I read some more things and explored some other things in the whole area of social network analysis. And this was an interesting concept because it was a way of just saying, how do we kind of look at all the ways that people talk to each other, who's talking to whom, what's happening, and how are the influences influencing what's going on, and where are people being isolated and so on. So it was a really quite formative book for me. It's just called The Hidden Power of Social Networks, and by a couple of guys out of the University of Virginia. And as I was reading through that, they were talking about this concept of positive energizers. Those were people in these organizations who were highly sought after and who were energizing to be around. And they were talking about just how significant they were and what they were able to contribute to the way the organization worked. And then they started to talk about the research that distilled down what they saw these energizers doing. And they came up with 5 things that these positive energizers were doing. And there were things like this. There were, let me just see the kind of note I made here. There were conversations that had a compelling goal. So this was one of the kind of key things that came through. There were conversations that had a high level of engagement. There were conversations that had meaningful contributions from both parties. What was the other one here? There was a real strong perception of progress. And there was a positive belief about things moving forward and that the goal could be achieved. These were 5 things they started to distill. And I said, I started to think, this is not a coaching book. This is even not a leadership book, but it was starting to say, these things are all things that I see we do in good coaching interactions. And then it was sort of like saying, don't look at the color red. Once you start to notice things, there were red things everywhere. So I started to see other things around as well. There was a book by Jane Dutton, whose work I'd read a bit. She's based in the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship, or I think it's still called that, in Michigan. She was saying the same things. She said, her book was, I've got a copy of that here too. These are the two I think are being quite informative. How to Energize Your Workplace. Again, not a coaching-based book. And she was saying that the whole notion of energy in organizations, like the other book, is really quite critical. How do we work with that? How do we encourage it? How do we nourish it? And she came up with some similar kinds of things in her research that said, it was all about leaders involved in respectful engagement and task enabling. They were kind of clusters of behaviors. And they were not just dissimilar to the other things as well. And then, so there's patterns emerging here. I'm starting to see, look, if we're looking to see how these organizations work that we talk about in a systematic way, these are the kind of things people are saying good leaders do. And I'm starting to think these line up pretty well with all the things we're talking about in terms of effective coaching conversations. And even though leaders are not maybe in formal coaching conversations all the time, these are kind of coaching-like behaviors. So there was a couple of things that got me started to thinking about is what we're doing in coaching actually help people lead in more effective ways, as well as helping them be better coaches, as it were. So that was kind of how I got started in thinking about it a little bit more. And I'm still trying to explore that a bit further. But, I'm interested in your take on this too, Ben.
Well, it's actually what struck me with both of those references you were talking about there, they both refer to energy. So those positive energizers, and then that second part talked about energy. And it's interesting when you think about what we want to do in coaching is to be able to energize some type of direction forward, energize people's motivation there. So it's interesting, that idea about, well, look at what energizes. And the other thing that stood out to me, what you were talking about there, was about what happens in the interaction, about these positive, I think it was Dutton's work you were just talking about there, something to do with that positive interaction there. And that's something that I think is really, really interesting about when we're sitting down working with someone, in a formal or informal coaching conversation. We talk about, well, what's the interaction between coach and coachee, but also what's the interaction that I want to have in the organization that I'm in? What impact do I want to have there? And there's some work that we referenced from probably the solution focused space. And I think Mark McCurr goes on next week there, but I think he talks about the difference. It's not about the individual, but the interaction in where the difference is, and the positive difference that we try to make. So that idea about what are the interactions that we're creating when we having conversations with someone, what change happens as a result of that interaction with them, I think is really interesting. And do we have a positive, energizing type change? Or is that interaction one that actually depletes and causes some type of negative impact there? So if you're linking it back to what we associate, I guess, with good coaching is, well, how can I have a positive interaction that creates a useful change with people through the conversations that I have? That was what really resonated, I guess, with what you were just talking about there.
Well, I mean, that's interesting too, because it leads on to another point that was coming out when I then started to look at leadership literature a bit in complex systems. So really getting specifically more into leadership stuff, whereas the other stuff wasn't particularly. This sort of thing came out again. So in fact, one particular paper started to talk about, look, the three things that leaders really need to do was related to one he called, this paper, and we can reference it later, was sense making, helping people make sense of situations. In fact, I'll just read the definition of that because I think that was pretty interesting to me. This writer talked about sense making as turning circumstances into a situation that is comprehended explicitly in words and that serves as a springboard to action. We read again, turning circumstances into a situation that's comprehended explicitly in words and serves as a springboard to action. Now, in some ways, that could be a kind of definition of coaching too, in a way that that's what we're kind of helping to see happen as people come to us and raise issues and so on. There's a whole language component. We're trying to bring that sense to it, and we're trying to move it to some new place. Now, secondly was learning, and thirdly was improvisation. Those three things we're saying. We need to be helping people learn, and we need to be helping people take steps in small directions to, this is where it goes to the social focus stuff. So small step action. So we're improvising, learning from what happens, and then revising and coming back again. So this writer was saying these three things were the key things that leaders in complex systems are doing. And again, it sort of hit the sort of button for me in terms of coaching related practices, but these are not coaches talking. This is not coaching literature. This is leadership stuff. And so that was the interesting thing I was finding.
Yeah, good. So just now that we're kind of talking more about what specifically happens, I guess, in the coaching space, I guess initially we're talking, what are we seeing in the literature that reflects back on good coaching practice? I'm curious about what you're seeing go the other way in terms of, well, what are the kind of skills that we focus on in good coaching practice that are being picked up then in terms of these general leadership traits or practices in terms of, you know, leading in these complex systems? You know, what's that link between some of those coaching skills there?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, there was you're lining up the things we would say that good coaches tend to do. And they were saying similar things. So in Jane Dutton's work, and talking about respectful engagement, it was genuine, being present, positive affirmation. It was questions. It was listening. I mean, that was, again, the sort of things that she's starting to talk about, and none of that's come out of, you know, a coaching space idea. And then, excuse me, she has a whole chapter on trust as well in that high quality connections thing she's talking about. So, and the whole notion about psychological safety and building that relational connection. And she doesn't use the term way of being, which we tend to talk about a bit, the coaching way of being, but there's implicit reference to that sort of thing as well. So that was the thing that kind of, again, alerted me to the fact that these people are talking about a whole range of conversational leadership practices that are pretty much the sorts of things we're talking about as we're working with coaches or leader as coaches. And that was encouraging.
Yeah. So I'm curious then, I think about, well, where does this come alive maybe in some of the contexts and the schools that, or the organisations we work with? It's interesting, I think, to think about theory and the practice there. You know, what's this actually look like in that space as well, I guess, when we're looking at particularly in schools there. And so when you're thinking about that, I was thinking about, well, when I work with schools and leaders, what does this actually look like inside there? And particularly separating out even, I'm interested in the difference between maybe more senior leaders within schools who are responsible for, in many ways, the culture of that organisation. So you talk about creating positive energy in organisations through how we lead, how we might bring a coaching approach to that. You know, leaders within schools set the tone in that space culturally. I think that's interesting. But I'm also really interested probably in that middle leadership level there. Middle leaders in organisations who are constantly having conversations with people, and what does it mean to be in practice a leader, you know, who's absorbed in that middle leadership space there. I'm not too sure if you've got any thoughts about how that plays out into either of those spaces there.
Yeah, well, it's you know, I've been doing a bit of work on a book that's been in my head for a while, and it's now sort of getting progressed to being a bit more on the page. And this is kind of what we've been thinking about in this book and trying to prepare this book. It's it's the way I'm starting to think about it in a different kind of context, that both senior and, if you like, middle leaders in schools are frequently dealing with a whole range of different kind of conversational contexts that they find themselves in. And so I've been starting to think about how can we conceptualize that a bit? How could we think about the way that happens so that it might give an opportunity to be a bit more intentional and purposeful about what happens. So started to think about a, kind of a matrix idea and looking at more formal contexts and informal contexts. And if you look at that on a kind of a vertical axis, there are a whole range of formal conversational contexts that leaders might involve in, and on the run, less formal. And then maybe horizontally, I'm thinking about a more directive approach and a less directive approach. And that's simply starting to think about the leader's role in initiating what might be discussed. So if we're looking at more formal and less directive in that kind of mix, that's kind of where formal coaching sits. Where the person being coached is setting the agenda, choosing broadly the areas they'll work on, and the coach is working in a more facilitative, less directive way. But it's a more formal setting. They'll maybe set an hour aside or some time, and there might be some documentation, there'll be some kind of agreement and so on in place. If you come down under that to what I'm calling less formal and still less directive, that's what that's where I'm seeing a whole lot of opportunities for middle level leaders to operate in, where there's coaching-like conversations or using a coaching approach. So here's a whole range of conversations. We're not sitting down, we're not taking notes. It might be, if you got a minute, I want to run something past you, but this has been initiated by the colleague or the team member, and so you're going to operate in a way that just responds to that. And it's an opportunity to use a coaching approach in that kind of conversation, helping people get clear on what they want, talk about what's already happening, look at possible options and so on, next steps and so on. But maybe none of that's written down, and it might be 10 minutes in an informal setting. And I suspect that a lot of school leaders spend a fair bit of time in that space, less formal, less directive. If you want to go to the other side, you've got less formal, but maybe the leader is initiating this. Want to sit down and have a chat about something that they've got some ideas about, and they're approaching the colleague or whatever, and then it might turn into some similar sort of things, establishing a clear endpoint, talking through in a coaching kind of way how this conversation might work, but the leader has perhaps been the initiator of that. And then in the formal and more directive end, that's where maybe your formal annual performance discussions happen that are generally scheduled and take place over a little bit of time, and or even where those maybe more difficult performance management conversations work, or a more formal conversation with a parent that is scheduled, and there's sort of various sorts of things that'll be more directive in the way that's meeting set up. So as I think I forget what we said, all models are wrong. Some are helpful, but just those kind of 4 types of conversations, I think, seem to describe a range of the ways in which school leaders will operate in this conversational space. And one of them is kind of formal coaching, but the other 3 are all what I say, involve a coaching approach, bringing a lot of those good elements of coaching, formal coaching, into contexts that aren't normally considered coaching. So that's the way it's shaping up. And most of this book will focus on the informal, less directive kind of conversations, those got-a-minute ones, and looking at those a little more closely. Yeah. So I think that's sort of got onto some of the things you were saying. But you've already you're working more directly at the moment with school leaders too. So what are you noticing about what's going on for them, particularly when you are out there, even though you maybe haven't been out there for a little while?
Yeah, look, I think what I find interesting about what you've just talked about with that matrix there, and the 2 continuums of formal to informal, directive to non-directive, what I hear often from leaders within schools is the challenge around how and when to do some of the more formal type work, how to put the right structures and processes in place to be able to enable that to be a natural part of what I do. So what resonates with what you're just saying there, from what I hear the experience, what I see the experience of leaders within schools, is the, yes, there's a real value of having that structured process in place, whether we call it coaching or not, but that structured time to have some facilitated reflection, to have that facilitated goal setting and clarity, all those things that you talked about are the positive energizers at the very beginning there. Yet at the same time, if we bring more consciousness to just the in the moment daily conversations that we're having, then for those people that I've heard seem to do this more naturally as part of their way of being, I see that the end results that they hope for to come out of the more formal conversations, they get anyway out of more informal conversations, because naturally they're creating conditions that people are reflecting more. They're thinking through a little bit more strategically or intentionally about what their goals are. They're planning in a little bit more constructive and positive ways, iterative ways, and doing that with others. So I guess what I've seen really work well and have heard it work well for people is when they're balancing out those elements there, but prioritizing some of the formal, but putting probably a lot more conscious energy around those informal type of conversations.
Yeah, well, this was what was kind of helpful to me, because it was the notion that these got a minute conversations are really where a lot of us live. And I was also struggling with the idea that, you know, we've all benefited by formal coaching sessions, and we've seen the value of what can happen there. And I think they'll be around, they'll stay. But, you know, they can be expensive, they're hard to roll out. I mean, it's hard to make available to lots of people, and yet and so that's the kind of, how do we get the benefits of coaching kind of rolled out to more people? And I started to see that, you know, these readings and whatever saying, hey, this is really the way people can lead. I mean, they're doing all these sorts of things you've been talking about. And so I got really interested in that. It's got a minute conversations, and not that every single conversation you're going to have is going to turn into a coaching-like conversation. I think that's not the message we want to suggest. I mean, sometimes it's just, we just need to hang out. But when there's something that, you know, people are wanting to work through or see changed, it doesn't have to be a long, involved, formal process. I think if you're skilled in these areas we're talking about, and that's kind of not a small if in some ways, because in some ways I think this sort of coaching on the run is harder. There's more constraints, it's less private, there might be noise around, distractions, those kind of physical things might be, you know, the time is less, people want to make some progress quickly. So to go into formal coaching mode is hard, and I think there's a level of agility or flexibility that is helpful to bring to those. But I do think, I've come to the view that I think transformation and really significant change can happen in small moments, and that it doesn't necessarily need to be in an hour-long formal session or whatever it is that's we're scheduled. So that was kind of what was really interesting to me about that belief I held. And then these other folks were just saying, hey, that's what our research is uncovering too, in a way that was very close to what I was thinking. Yeah. So that's how that chapter's shaping up. And we wrote a little bit about that, Christian and I, in a Leader's Guide, and it's really an attempt to, the Leader's Guide to Coaching in Schools, that book, but we're really trying to expand that out a bit more and just see if we can make some more sense of that and give people some more tools and ideas as to how to turn those moments that might be potential coaching moments into something that can really mean something significant for both people involved.
I think when you talk about that, what's the significant impact that you would like to have from being able to have a conversation with someone, and it's I was just thinking there about even some stuff, work around self-determination and DC's and Ryan's work there about being able to draw out from the other person their own choice and their own way forward in something. So if as a leader, I'm having conversations with people that draws out from within them what their own intentions are, their own motivations, their own ways forward, the type of impact that I'm having on that individual is potentially very, very positive there. but also, I guess, as the leader, where that then aligns with making sure it links in with the overall direction that we're taking the school. And I think that's an interesting piece maybe to add in here is how do we bring this coaching way of leading where it is about drawing out from the other person, creating the conditions for that person to be able to decide and to own what they're going forward, and still making sure that as a leader, we are heading in a direction that the school is intending to go in, that there is that alignment there as well as that autonomy. I'm not too sure if that's come out in any of your thinking or what you've read there as well.
Yeah, it does. I think, I think when we talk about goal setting, and we use iSmart acronyms and so on to talk about that, and the R word can mean a few things in different ways. That's timed up, but I always find it helpful to think about it relevant. That it needs to be relevant to what we're about, and to broadly within the school direction and the vision and so on that might have been set. But within that, there'll be quite a lot of discretionary choice about what people are choosing to focus on, or what just might be on their mind. So these informal ones might just be a situation that I've got in my current thing that would be good to have a sounding board, and I'd like it to change and be different from what it is. So there's various different levels of that. In the formal coaching, I think, yes, that would be more carefully negotiated. But what you've said has reminded me of actually the whole notion about how that underpins leaders coaching is the power thing. The fact that just, you're in a more powerful role. So there's a dynamic there that is there. You have to manage that because people will recognize that you have authority or whatever. And so that changes the way that works. So the whole level of autonomy and so on that you were talking about there becomes part of how you deal with that too. And, there are some people who would say, I think, can a leader really coach someone on their team? And they would answer no, because of that power differential that is there. And some people have started to write about this a bit more. It's been useful to look at. But so I think that's relevant a bit to what you're raising in terms of how much as a leader do I influence what we might be needing to direct things on. And that's where I think having the continuum about directive, less directive gives permission to sort of shuffle along that. And there may well be, if we're having a conversation about a safety issue or a compliance issue, then we need to kind of work within certain parameters, even related to, stuff that's happening in schools back in Australia at the moment with how all this is working with COVID-19 related safety measures and protocols and so on. There's some things around that are just a given. And so that's kind of, maybe that's not totally answering your question there, but I think the power thing comes into play there and how that works out with choice and autonomy and which people are choosing to work on.
I think what you did say there, which was I think stood out to me, was the fact that I may not be able to do the formal coaching if that status or power becomes an issue, but in the daily conversations, I can lead in that coaching way. And I can have conversations that create change. I can have conversations that energize people. And so those little informal moments actually become more powerful in that way. And if I'm doing that then as the leader, what modeling and example is that then potentially doing for others, all right? In terms of middle leaders being able to do that, but also, and we've not spoken about it, I guess teacher leaders here as well, those who lead from the classroom. So, I don't need to be in that formal positional leadership overall as a school. If I'm leading forward and stepping up in that way, then I'm stepping up in a way that creates a space that creates change from room to room around a school.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's right. So that this doesn't necessarily mean, formal leadership roles. That's where some of the power issues and other things will certainly play out. But I think what's another thing that's been coming through some of the other stuff I've been looking at too is the notion of progress. And it came up in one of these lists, the perception of progress in the original Cross and Parker work, but I've seen it mentioned elsewhere too. And one of the key motivating things for people in organisation that keeps them engaged is their sense of things moving forward. And, you know, we've probably all sat in meetings at different times and we wondered whether we've achieved anything out of being there, and it didn't seem to make anything move forward. And that's how dispiriting and de-energizing that can be. So what, again, you've seen in some other bits of research is this notion about progress. So what I'm getting to here is, I think in a range of the conversations that we might be involved in, leader to leader or leader to colleague or colleague to colleague, I think there's a great, if we can help people make progress, even just small steps in their thinking, then we'll probably serve them well in even a small way. And again, that's another key coaching principle. So, you know, I remember Tony Grant talking about that kind of thing, and the whole notion about writing stuff down so that it can be an action that gets committed and there's some definite thing that's going to change and move on from what you've been talking about. Those sort of things, that sort of thing can happen in just about any conversation. What's happening next? What will you do next on this? And that doesn't need to be formal leadership that's facilitating that.
Yeah. There are a couple of interesting questions that people have kind of posted here, John, and one of them from Nick from earlier. He says, you know, he likes your fluid approach to the relationship without calling out coaching per se. So rather about the relationship, you know, and he wants to know, do you think coaching or emphasis on coaching can get in the way of the relationship and other solutions at time?
Yeah, I think it can. I think you can. I think there's some baggage around the terminology that some people are carrying around, and it's not a helpful term at times, you know. And then on the other side, there is maybe even some time in which we need to maybe make explicit what we think of doing. Would it be useful to just ask some questions about this topic and work it through that way? And sometimes, yeah, you might just need to share what you know about it too, and give people a tip to move on from. So if we kind of make it too much coaching, is that going to get in the way? Yeah, it could. And I guess this gets to the concept of to what extent we've totally integrated coaching way of being and what we might call coaching skills into who we are, so that that's just how, you know, how you show up in conversations and so on, can operate in this sort of way, and maybe give people a choice about whether they would like to sort of talk the issue through in this particular way or not, and that might be, you know, how the culture is set up in an organization. That might be how it works. I've been reading about concept of spot coaching. I hadn't come across that until just recently, where people set up 15 minutes or something, and they have a spot coaching session, and they can just book those, and that's quite contained, and, you know, it's probably a little bit more like formal coaching, but it's kind of short, and organizations have kind of been putting these in place, and you can go and work with, you know, an identified coach and book a 15-minute, I just got this thing I want to talk to you about. And so from the start, that's been articulated as a mini coaching session, I guess. So it clarifies some of those kinds of assumptions and agreements. Not sure if that's answered that question. Have you got any thoughts on that? Look,
the only thing that came to me as you were talking there, I think whenever anyone engages in something with authenticity, and if they're not just talking about what they're doing, but they are living it, and maybe that does come into that idea or that way of being there. But if I do say, I do believe in, say, coaching there, and I make that explicit, I don't need to be apologetic about that. This is something I believe in and we're doing it. So I think it's okay to be explicit about that, so long as I'm backing that up when I'm in the moment as well as out of the moment. So long as my conversations that I'm having out there more generally are also of that same authentic nature, then I do wonder if perhaps it doesn't matter so much whether I'm, you know, talking about it formally as well as informal, because I think the relationship, and that's what the question there was talking about, the relationship is authentic to what the coaching is doing. So they're aligned in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is, it is that relationship stuff. And if that's fake. People see through that pretty quickly. And I mean, the authenticity, and it even allows you to make errors in the way that you operate. That is not to be perfect at how you do it, but if you come across in a real authentic way, and there's people will, I think, give you room to move on that sort of stuff. So, but it does come down to the relational stuff. I mean, it's, and I'm just looking at a quote, I think was a good one here that came out of that article. This guy was saying, he said, complex adaptive system theory suggests that the quality of the relationship may be more important to system performance than the quality of the individual agents. I take that to mean that the way we get people connecting as leaders or peer-to-peers or whatever, it can actually be more significant to how we work together and how the whole organization performs than a whole bunch of really, really strong individual performance. And nothing wrong with that, but it's this notion of how we bring together in this relational way. And I think coaching gives real purpose and intent and movement in those kind of relationships. That is allows them to be more purposeful in that way, and I think starts to highlight these other things we've been seeing coming out in the the non-coaching research. Yeah.
I think it's also important that it does say, well, if the relationship is so key as well, as opposed to just the individual there, then it does validate the fact that what happens when we're in conversation with someone is important. It does create change. Whether that is a leader having a conversation with a team member, a peer-to-peer, or even a teacher with a student there. The nature of that relationship is what helps to create the growth, the learning, the change, and not just what is happening within the individual themselves. Even though agency is important, even though I need to draw upon my own resources, a lot of that change happens between the individuals there.
Yeah, definitely, and it's sometimes hard work because I've seen the term emotional labor in the readings a bit more recently, saying that people like school leaders and others working in human intensive organizations where, if you like, what we're working on is nurturing, a human being to flourishing state. There's a high level of emotional labor in that kind of work. We're not just making, drugs in a drug company or things that we ship out to market. It's a much more nuanced, subtle, complex bit of work. And so they're very people-intensive organization skills. So when we're talking about these relational kind of challenges and opportunities, I think there's a whole well-being thing comes up here too, because it can be, emotionally exhausting work. And that's why we do things.
A question was asked early on by Christian there, when we're talking about the piece around energy, how do leaders sustain their own motivation and energy so they can support others? So supporting those who support others.
Well, exactly. I mean, and I think one of the things I'm starting to do some research now as part of the study I'm doing relates to this whole concept of how do we support leaders through these emotionally labor intensive roles that they're in. And I think reflective practice stuff. I think the notion about peer support is one thing I'm starting to look at. How can we make that available to leaders to allow them to be nourished, refreshed, and maintain their own sense of well-being? Because I think that is vital. And if they're not in a position to be able to do that, that'll impact on the work that they do. So it's been interesting to come across that term, emotional labor. And but essentially, the kind of thing I'm seeing that people are arguing that supports that is more just the sort of support we're seeing them provide for staff and colleagues and whatever is what they need to have too. And so it's social support in different kinds of ways that has been highlighted in some of these things I've been reading about. Yeah.
So leader does, I guess, strategically, if they're putting systems in place so that they know that their staff members within their own organisation have those relationships of support they're getting those opportunities to be able to be coached formally or informally, it is then thinking, well, what am I doing strategically for self as well? And that's not being selfish, that is being strategic to look after in that way, to sustain self. So whether that's externally, whether that's with a peer. One of the cohorts that I do a lot of work with is beginning principals, those within the first couple of years of their principalship. And one of the most common thing, obviously, is that seems to happen is that danger of burnout, of trying to give more and more and more to set things up, but not thinking and not really giving permission to self to make sure I've got my own network there as well. So whether that's a formal network of coaching, of relationship support, or more formally at times, I think it's a really important piece.
Yeah, and I know you've done some work on that too with some cohorts of school leaders in the kind of peer-based support, different kind of mechanisms to how you can set that up. And there's interesting things coming out on that too. And that's actually what I want to look at a bit as well in terms of how, as they've been played around with a bit, various kinds of peer-based coaching programs for teachers, mainly for teachers. To this point, it seems. How do they work? And the jury's out. Some of them are mixed. Some of them are saying, yeah, this was great. Others are saying, no, it hasn't been great. It seems to be one of the things that's missing where it hasn't been poorly implemented, or they've been poorly prepared to be in the coaching role, in the peer support role. So I'm just trying to think about how much of a difference that might make when people really know how this works. Can that play a role in leader well-being? I just think it seemed got more complicated in the last 2 months, and all that stress that schools have been under online, everything else going, responding, going back, individualizing all this stuff, and mixed back for part of the time, not for part. It's been pretty heavy going. So I do think there's a coaching role in here, and the challenge is how do we make it available in a cost-effective way? And that's another way I've been trying to think about too. And I think there is an opportunity to do something with peer-based support groups that could be useful. So looking at that a bit too.
Yeah. Look, I'm just conscious of, we said we'd go for about 45 minutes. I'm just wondering, there's another good question there that I really like to get to, maybe before we wrap some things up, John. There's a question from Deb really about, what are your thoughts about the extent to which leaders using a coaching approach to leading relies on or influences school culture, right? So what's that link, I guess, between, culture to this way of leading?
Yeah. Well, maybe, I don't know. Would you have some thoughts on that? And look, I might chime in.
And I don't know if this is what the question was getting at there, but it's almost what influences what. Is if I am bringing a coaching way of leading, does that influence the culture am I trying to create a culture where this is how we converse with one another? This is how we support practice, develop one another's practice. Or is it going the other way where, culture influences? If we have a culture of trust, a culture of openness, then are we more likely now to create the leaderships there? So perhaps I'm answering this as I talk it out loud, but it probably feeds both ways there. I don't think you can remove culture from without what are the intentional things that we do within an organisation about how we interact. If culture is, how we are with one another, what we prioritise, what we believe, what we do when no one else is looking, as I've heard it informally being spoken about.
Yeah.
If this is authentically how I go about developing, supporting, and the relationships, then I think we do create a culture of that. I think some things might happen incidentally, but I think it also has to happen quite intentionally as well. Because while any cultural change occurs when we get a critical mass of people wanting to do this, and so I think you have to strategically create some of that. But I think then it does become a bit of a way of being in the organisation. But then those who don't come on board with that, then I think there's some intentional things we need to do in leadership to be able to bring those in and manage that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for going first on that, because I wasn't quite exactly sure whether the question was asked, and I think I'm a bit clearer on it now. And I do think, it works. I guess I would say similar things. It works in both ways. I mean, but I also think there is leaders are leaders of language in schools. I think it's a quote from somewhere, from Keegan and Lay or whatever. But I think we can play a role in setting the pace and the tone and the positive energy, if you like, from these kinds of things we've seen. And I've also seen too, for instance, in just establishing the culture, like we found it useful, we use our little growth model cards, to actually encourage people to get it out and say, this is how we're going to have maybe a brief conversation around this. And so it legitimizes that, and that's the kind of way I think you can start to bring a little bit of that culture change in, or maybe even my little matrix diagram I'm thinking about here. What kind of conversation would it be useful for us to have now? And making some of these signs and symbols a little more prominent and as cues that can be around the place, and without it becoming too over the top. It's, I think, can be a useful way of saying, would this be a helpful way to move you through or progress this issue that you want to explore?
Yeah.
And that becomes
I guess if you talk about what's visible, yes, we can make prompts visible and probably at early stages of adopting something. But I guess the most visible way of making it is in the actual interactions itself, isn't it? So when I experience a conversation, when I see a conversation occurring like that, that's the best way for me to prompt into, hey, this is what I want to do more of as well. Yeah. Yeah,
and then if people are going away those with our energy and clarity and actions, as we talk about, those three things, then that's likely to continue to replicate, and people will see. This might have looked a little bit awkward initially, but I'm seeing where it's going, and it's been useful, and it'd be worth doing that again. Or I'd like to learn how to do that better myself. And then you've got a mass of people starting to operate in a similar way, and I think that's pretty amazing place to be. Places are getting to that.
There are a number of questions in here about taking coaching or these conversations to the peer level. And I think we could do a whole other conversation on that, because it's something I'm really interested in, because at the end of the day, while a leader in an organisation or in a team very much sets a tone and very much sets a, models and sets an expectation of how we're going to be, ultimately the power of interactions comes from all the other little social interactions. And you began by talking about, I guess, the systems, and the level of interactions within a system are more powerful or quantifiable by all the peer interactions. And I think it'd be really interesting to think about how we really capitalize or grow those peer interactions in terms of informal, but also some of those formal conversations there. But I think we could go on a whole another topic about that as well.
Yeah, maybe we're getting out of time here, but that was the interesting thing about the very first bit of research I referred to. It wasn't talking initially about leaders. The real positive energizers were just regular people in the networks that were drawing people to them. And here's what they found. In fact, the research, the managers in this organization were isolated in these networks. They were seen as less positive, not quite toxic necessarily, but less energizing, and they actually wanted to find out, well, what can we do? So that the study led to the leaders picking up on some of the things that all these other folks were doing who weren't, doing it with their peers, doing it upwards, downwards, sideways, these kind of ways they brought to it. So that was interesting in that initial study.
Good. Yeah. Look, John, there's been a bit of interest in some of the resources that you've talked about. You're able to make those available to people, at least a bit of a reference list there?
Yeah, I think that's, there's an email that goes out with a number of those different links, and I think there's some of the papers could be actual links to hot links where you could download them. Some of them are in text, but if you Google some of those text names, there's usually something comes up on those as well. But Jane Dutton's work in Center, Michigan and whatever is available in various forms, not this particular book necessarily up online, but various related things. So we can make sure all of this goes into a follow-up email, and people can then kind of chase after things they find interesting.
Well, actually, if they go to the website after the recording, they will see all the resources that you have named, and we'll make that available for all of them.
Okay, yeah, I thought that was happening, yeah.
So I really wanted to thank John and Ben. You're both the rich, the thought-provoking conversation we've had tonight. Thank you so much. We appreciate your generosity. Next week, we're going to be joined with Jason Pascoe. He's going to chat with Mark Mapurgo about enhancing the quality of conversations. That's going to happen on the 3rd of June at 7 p.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in London, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thanks again, John and Ben, for giving up your time, sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the talk.
Bye for now.
Take care. Bye.